welcome to this week's book club episode of Homeschool Moms Unfiltered. I'm your host, Amanda, and my fabulous co-host is...
Hello, I'm Meagan.
Perfect. So this week, we are continuing our discussion of the Homeschooler's Guide to Transcripts and Portfolios. We'll be discussing chapters 4 and 5. So we're still on portfolios, and I'm going to be honest, okay? There are some really good takeaways. There's, some of those common sense things that you're like, oh yeah, you just needed someone to say it. Especially if you're in this stage or you're concerned about reaching this stage. But also, there are plenty of pages you can skim. Okay, so don't look at this massive book and be like, oh man, I don't know, right? Like, it's got good information, but it's also laid out really well. It's got good title headings, section headings, good pull-out boxes that are helpful. And then if you end up getting it, you can come back and listen. We always reference the page numbers that we found useful or where we found interesting things. You don't have to actually read the whole thing because Meagan and I were talking. We both definitely skimmed some things and then realized like, oh, we're reading this for other people. Like, we got to go back and read it a bit more carefully.
Yeah, if I was reading it solely for personal use, I'd have skimmed even more hardcore and just kind of pulled out the highlights and the high notes. I think I've definitely learned some stuff from this book, and I really quite like this book. I would definitely recommend it, but skimming definitely works. And yeah, I totally had to go back and reread some sections because I was reading and I'm like, this would never apply to us. This isn't how we function. I can't imagine a situation where I would use this. And then I was like, oh, wait, you're being really selfish. We're reading this to discuss the book for other people too. So you have to read it from the perspective of other people. But I didn't feel a tremendous connection to some of the sections this week. But there were some sections in here that I saw where I thought, oh, this would be super helpful if you live in a high regulation state like New York or Pennsylvania. Or this would be super helpful if you are a single divorced parent or considering divorce, approaching divorce, going through the process, because we see how many posts in Facebook groups about people being spiteful in divorces, and you've been successfully homeschooling for like 6, 7, 8 years, and now you're getting a divorce, and now all of a sudden the other person is demanding the kids be put in school. And so you're having to fight for that right to homeschool. And so there's some stuff in there that I was like, oh, these would be really helpful situation for these particular situations. But for my own purposes, some of it was super granular in a way that I didn't find amazingly applicable. So, yeah. Well, let's dive in, Amanda. You've got the first thought of the book this week. So what you got?
Yeah, so like I said, we're starting with chapter 4. It's titled Creating Your Portfolio. So Meagan said it great, right? These sections, they just really get into like the nitty gritty, the nuts and bolts. In general, right at the very beginning on page 58, she has a thing. It says, what does a portfolio look like? It has a cover letter, a title page, table of contents, narrative summary, reflections, artifacts, and then a resume or transcript is optional. And it's one of those things. We talked in our last book club episode, about the fact that we do have kind of 2 different portfolios, a really big comprehensive one, and then we have to provide a very small, and we do it electronically for the most part. But every month we have to provide a small portfolio to our oversight school. I honestly would have never thought to include all of these things. And again, part of that is because of the format that we work in and what we have to do. But it was good. Yeah, kind of one of those things, like just good reminder. This is useful. And she goes into in quite a bit of depth and detail why these things should all be included and how to utilize them to help you better present what you're doing. So I thought it was useful.
Yeah, I heavy highlighted that list of bullet points there, where I went up and down with my highlighter like a good 6 times, and it's quite boldly highlighted. My daughter is a big portfolio keeper because she's an artist. And I explained in our previous episode, she's been to portfolio reviews at colleges already as a teenager. She's been to portfolio reviews through guilds and artist associations. And she and I had a nice chat at like 2:00 this morning, actually, about these components that are here and just ways to kind of structure her portfolio a little bit differently. And she and I both agreed that that was some pretty solid feedback. She does not currently have like a table of contents, for example. And I think that would just give it such cohesion and so much structure in a way that would just really take it to the next level. I really liked that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep, definitely.
I made a note on the next page on 59 where it talks about unschooling a little bit, which we are unschoolers. And it says, if you engage in unschooling or base your homeschool program on technology or apprenticeships, which seems like a pretty random like grouping of things, right? Like technology, apprenticeships, and unschooling, like how those things, I'm not quite sure. But she says the contents of your portfolio may look different from what reviewers expect. I will just say from an unschooling perspective, I am admittedly a little bit lazy when it comes to educating other people on unschooling. It feels like such a gargantuan task and people just truly don't understand it in so many ways. We're seeing that right now. There was a person on TikTok who made some videos about unschooling. I mean, it made it to like Newsweek and Time Magazine and stuff, like where people are up in arms about it being child neglect and this, that, the other thing. They don't understand it, right? And you're not going to explain it in a 90-second TikTok. So, or at least not explain it well, apparently, because people are very upset. She's trying, but it's not working. So I take the lazy man's route and make things look like people expect it to. Right? I'm not going to sit there and be like, let me educate you on the principles of unschooling. And I guess it kind of depends also on the purpose of this portfolio. A lot of what is in this section looks like it's, I really want to know what state this lady lives in, because a lot of this feels like it's being, oh, thank you.
I looked it up because I was super curious too. I'm like, is she in New York? Like, where is this coming from? Like, what has her so tinfoil hatty? But that was a different, Massachusetts.
Okay, so the really interesting thing is we have a friend who lives in Massachusetts who unschools and is not to this degree of like battling the school system and all that kind of stuff. She has no issues. So, and granted, this book is a little bit older. It's what, I think 2000?
Almost 25 years. Yeah.
Okay. So
right
maybe the public school mentality or the interaction with the school boards have shifted in part over the years, right? Maybe it's because Loretta isn't lazy like me and did take the time to educate some people on the principles of unschooling. I don't know. But for me, I would rather just make the portfolio look a little bit more like what they anticipate and not have to fight that battle every single time. So that was just my thought. Like, if you're unschooling, that's a really big nut to crack, you know? And it's just, it feels like you're trying to steer a really big ship and like change direction of a really big ship that you're probably not going to change the direction of. So for me, I'm like, I can't be bothered. I have a limited number of hours in the day. I'm always tired. I'm always spread thin. I'm constantly feeling like I don't have enough of me to give to my kids and all that kind of stuff. Changing the mindset of the public school system about unschooling through portfolio explanation is like not on my to-do list. It's just not, you know. I'm like, just put together the portfolio they want to see and make it happen. You know, don't lie. I'm not saying lie, but take your experience and turn it into a language that they understand.
Yeah. And I definitely have that point at a few different points throughout these next couple chapters, right? That kind of stuff comes up a fair bit in these 2 chapters this week.
I like it. All right. I have a couple of next notes. I feel like I balanced my notes a lot better this time, though. There are some sections where you have a good run of notes, so it's not just me with all my notes this week. On page 60, there's a little call out box. I just love books with call out boxes. It reminds me of like Who Was books and stuff like that. Like they're just, I don't know, they're fun to read. So there's a call out box on page 60 that says, keep your table of contents to a single page. It shows you've been reflective and selective, and that you respect the reviewer's time. They'll appreciate not having to wade through a year's worth of paperwork searching for a few items of importance. And it was interesting. So not last night, but the night before, we were out. I get in a lot of great talks with my kids on dog walks. And so I tend to bring it up a lot. People probably think the dog is like, you know, like skeletal from the amount of times that we walk her, but it just tends to be that's when we get our really great conversations in, because we're all, you know, free and not distracted and all that. And, you know, some days different kids join me on different days. It's not like there's not like a sign up sheet. It's just like, I'll send out a family text and say, anybody want to go for a walk? And off we go. And so my daughter was telling me about feedback that she received about an entry that she just submitted to the conference that she was at in Kansas. And one of the pieces of feedback was that her artist statement was too long. And the judge literally said, like, TLDR, too much, like too much. And there was a character count, and she was within the character count, but it was still more than that particular judge wanted to see. And so when she and I were talking last night, I kind of notated that for her there. And then on the next page, I feel like I don't know that we've addressed the use of the term artifacts yet in this book. I love the use of the term artifacts. Like, I feel like there wasn't a good alternative in my brain beforehand, like stuff in your portfolio. Like, what was the alternative, right? Examples.
Paperwork and shit.
Yeah. Samples sounds a little bit like, I don't know, like a fecal sample. I don't know. Like, it's like artifacts has like this really magical feel to it. Like it's got a nice ring to it. I really like it, so I just love the use of the word artifacts. It conjures feelings of it being like a really treasured, valued piece of work that you're including. And so I like that.
I can't help but laugh because I just always refer to it as like all of our homeschooling crap.
Yeah.
I'll just put it in the pile of crap. I'll organize it later. You're right. Artifacts does sound a little bit nicer than homeschooling crap.
It's got like this nice, like, ooh, how fancy, We had, when my kids were really small, we had a nanny, which I've said before, I worked full time, and hiring a nanny is cheaper than daycare for 3 kids in the US. So we had a nanny, and I am a huge Sound of Music fan. I have been ever since I was a kid. And it didn't occur to me early enough in the hiring process that we should have called the nanny a governess just so that I could live out like my Fraulein Maria dreams. And it's still a regret to this day that I didn't use the right terminology. It would have been so much more magical of an experience.
Opportunity lost.
I know. So artifacts is like along those lines for me.
Yeah. I almost every morning I ask my kid if he's ready to tackle the day with vim and vigor. And so it's become this like joke in our family, right? Like, I've got some vim, but I've got no vigor, or I've lost both my vim and my vigor this morning, but we're here, So I kind of have the next comment, it looks like. And that's just, we're still really close together here. On page 62, she's talking about aesthetics. And I just wanted to point out that is so important, right? Last year, I had to hire some new people in a other position that I'm in, right? And it was really easy to see who was old and out of touch and who wasn't. And you can Google it. It's really easy to Google and see what current trends look like, whether that's resumes or portfolios or cover pages. But the fonts that you're using, the white space you're using, the graphics, the layouts, all of that stuff, you can either choose to use whatever you learned decades ago when you wrote your first resume or your first cover letter, or you can, Google and try to like be a little bit more on trend. And, you have to remember your audience, obviously, but if this is supposed to be coming from your kid and they send in something that looks like a 45-year-old put it together in a basic word processing document, like, that's not going to help your case, right? They're not going to be like, oh yes, this was definitely put together by a 17-year-old. They're going to be like, oh, your mommy did that for you. Hey, and remember, white space is your friend. Like, this is not the days of typewriters. Like, white space is your friend.
I do like that. On the same page on 62, I liked this line that said, remember, portfolios are an open-ended process, not a cookie cutter product. And I liked that differentiation. I tend to feel a little tired by the portfolio process, and I only have one kid, who's maintaining a portfolio, and she's mainly doing it by herself. But it feels like every time there's an event where it needs to be, wheeled out and showcased to the world, it's like, oh my gosh, here we go again. Because there's always this flurry of, should I include this? Should I not include? And I'm like, okay, like, I just need to reframe my mind about the fact that this is a process. It's an ongoing process. It's a living entity. And I just need to get past it.
Yeah. It's a journey, not the destination.
Yes. Okay. I cracked up because our next note is the same, and we tend to view things quite differently. And there's There's a call out box on page 65 that literally feels like we went to some sort of like new age meditation ceremony about portfolios. And I wrote in the margin, this is a little too out there for me. Like,
and I just wrote, really, give me a break.
it was a bit much. It was literally like a yoga class meets like an LSD trip meets a portfolio
Meditative
session.
journaling in my world. Like
Yeah.
meditative journaling is not my jam. But if that is your jam, you might love this call out box on page 65.
Page 65. It's all you.
Yep. You go on with your bad self.
A little too much for me. But on 65 it did talk about mind mapping, and I have to tell you, my 12-year-old is wildly neurodiverse. I have 3 neurodivergent kids, but my 12-year-old is, I've mentioned before, the one who needs the most accommodation in order to kind of navigate the world smoothly, or somewhat smoothly. And he took a mind mapping class a couple of years ago on OutSchool that literally, he took so much away from this class. And to be honest with you, how neurodivergent is this? I'm not sure the things he took away from the class were the things that were on the agenda for the class. Like, he might have been in his own class, even though he was in the same class as everyone else. He was like doing his own thing. But oh my goodness, he's made like major life changes as a result of the mind mapping that they did in this class, which was really cool. So I liked the fact that it was brought up here. If you're not familiar with mind maps, there's a whole section on here, and there's an example on page 66. But it's a type of graphic organizer. And I feel like I did this in school even. It wasn't called mind mapping back in the day. But you draw idea bubbles, and then you connect the idea bubbles, and the main thoughts are big bubbles, and the supporting thoughts are small bubbles, right? I mean, that's kind of the idea of mind mapping to an extent. Did you mind map under a different term, Amanda?
Yeah, that's it. So I found it funny actually, because in some assessments and things that we've had done with our kiddo, it has come up on many occasions that he would benefit from mind mapping. And many occasions I have gone back to our school and said, like, that's great. I think that's wonderful. I don't know what the mind mapping is, and I need you to help me with this. Like, is there a class? Is there a tutor that can teach him? Is there a teacher that will teach him these skills? Like, I don't know what it is, and I don't want to learn. I've learned how to teach this curriculum, and I've learned how to teach that curriculum, and I'm learning how to do these things to help him. Like, can someone else just take on whatever the fuck mind mapping is and teach him how to mind map? But we do this graphic organizer all the time. It's his favorite style of graphic organizer to do. And so then I was like,
oh my gosh, I'm a mind mapping expert, and I didn't even know it.
Yeah. I mean, I made him like all kinds of, like, I've made him this special with different shapes, and it's got a vocab list on the side to help him keep his thoughts organized. Like, apparently we mostly have it. So
you're a mind mapper. All right,
well, there you go. All right.
Add it to your resume.
I do know.
Add it to your resume. I'm telling you, it's too funny. Yeah, my kid, okay, he took this mind mapping class that had nothing to do with like chore charts or anything like that. Like, that wouldn't have appealed to me in that way, right? He came out of class. He'd been in it for a while. He came out of class. Can you buy me a little whiteboard? Sure. I love a good whiteboard. Like, sure. What do you need a whiteboard for? He made himself his own, I say chore chart, but it was really more like a daily checklist of a way to like manage his day. And he totally chose the stuff that he wanted to put on there. There was stuff on there that wouldn't have occurred to me. Like, he had like a minimum requirement of outdoor time for himself for vitamin D. Like, I was like, okay, have at it. Like, he made a rule for himself that he cannot be asked to do something twice, that he has to either do it right away or challenge himself to remember to do it, or set a timer to do something a sec. And I was like, wow, like, this did not come from me. And then the funny thing was, he put the reward system into place too. And he was like, so if I do all of these things, can I get a pack of Pokemon cards every Sunday? And I was like, sure. Like, you're parenting yourself, so I'm not really sure. I guess I can supply a pack of Pokemon cards, right? And that was the thing. And he's still doing it. Like, it's been years, and he's got this whole system, but somehow he got this in a mind mapping class. And I am 99% sure that was not the purpose of this class, but I'm like, hey, however you got there, we're good. I don't really care. He's loving it. It's working for him. All right. So the next note that I had written down was on 69. I really liked this one. It says homeschoolers can usually boost the credibility of their entire portfolio by including some sort of verification by a source outside of your home. And as my kids have gotten older, I have found that to be exceptionally helpful, because not everyone's always going to take your mommy's word for it, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
and they know that there are parents who are not the most impartial judges of their own children, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I really like that. And my kids have implemented that. It's been really helpful to have mentors, to have life coaches, to have executive function coaches, like whoever they're interacting with. My kiddo has a math tutor, all this stuff that exists, that people that they're functioning with outside of us as parents, to be able to get letters of recommendation or feedback or anything like that. Huge. So having that circle and kind of having those trusted resources and building those connections, especially as they get older, for us has been really beneficial and really worthwhile. So I just wanted to kind of toss that out there.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. The same for me. We had talked in a previous episode, something you had kind of mentioned how your kid doesn't have all A's. And for me, like, I liked school. I was good at school. It was easy for me. And the idea of not having all A's would have like absolutely paralyzed me, right? I didn't get my first B until I was in university. Um, so the idea that my kid would have less than A's, I'm like, I suppose it's possible, but it didn't even really cross my mind, right? But as a homeschool parent, it's, I feel like you have to provide extra justification for that on a report card. If my kid is great across the board, other people need to be saying that as well. I can't just be like, oh, well, my kid is great and he got all A's, right? Like people are going to be like, yeah, right. But how good is he actually? So yeah, I totally agree with the whole. And this is another one of those themes that comes up over and over in these chapters, right? The credibility.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we've kind of been tainted by those mothers who were like, my child would never, and it's like, oh, your child totally does,
Totally does.
And so, like, as soon as you say my child would never, it's pretty much guaranteed they're totally about to do that thing. And so, yeah, it shoots our credibility because that's what people assume because they've had negative experiences with that sort of parent. So
Mm-hmm.
it happens. So we both have notes on page 70, but different notes. Yours is at the top of the page. You want to hop in first?
Sure. So there's a pull-out box, another one of those great boxes. And it just basically is reminding you to remember that you're the author. And so select the story you want to tell. And if in the portfolio process, you're the narrator, make your story convincing and entertaining. And, oftentimes you're both. So just to kind of remember which role you're playing and play it accordingly. And I thought that was just a good, really succinct way of breaking that down.
I didn't call that out, but I like that. I really like it. I have a note a little further down on 70, and I really liked this where it said, it says you may have an artifact you intuitively know has a place in the portfolio, but you cannot find the words to describe why it fits. If you cannot explain to yourself why it belongs in your portfolio, then the reviewer surely will not understand. The item needs clarification. And I thought, wow, that's really cool. Like if you can't do an elevator pitch, perhaps for every single item that's in there, they're definitely not going to get it. Or if the elevator pitch is, 6 degrees of separation from the item or a quantum leap from the item, you just need to connect those dots. Amanda and I were talking before we started recording about how the number of examples that we see in our professional worlds that we operate in outside of our podcast where people just don't read details, right? And they're just and it's not, people are just busy, right? They're so busy that they're taking things at surface level, they're skimming, they're going quick, they're rushing. And so we can't put it on someone to make those connections on their own. Not to mention, they may just think completely differently than you, or their past experiences may be completely different than you, and they're not going to make the same connection or the connection that you're hoping they will, which could really be detrimental to whatever your goal is with your portfolio. Yeah. So I liked that notation there. Okay, there's a note on 71. Now, I have this in other sections later too, where it talks about there's kind of like a post-mortem debrief on a portfolio session that goes on for like a page and a half, right? About really like analyzing this reviewer. It seems like there's a lot in here that assumes that you're always going to have the same reviewer. Now, my understanding is you have like an assigned teacher in California for your charter school, right? So you are meeting with somebody. There's consistency there, right?
Yes, we have the same teacher year after year. And so that definitely, I think we will have this teacher through 6th grade. And then when he's officially, like, according to the state, right? Once he's after 6th grade, he gets someone new, and then he might get someone new again in high school if we stay with that system. But
Okay.
it does seem that that is not the case for a lot of people and in a lot of circumstances.
Yeah, and so that was kind of my thought, was like, how do you know you're getting the same person? Like, and I kind of had you in mind. I was like, I think under your circumstances you do. But for example, on 71, there's a call out box. Does it meet their standards of excellence? And so it's like, when you're looking at the artifacts in your portfolio, thinking about what the reviewer is looking for. One of the really interesting things with my kiddo who keeps her portfolio is that it's never really being seen by the same person twice. At any time she even enters work, it's not being judged by the same people. So I'll give you an example. I've talked about the fact she just came back from this conference in Kansas. She entered a piece there. She entered a piece at that same conference 2 years ago. It's only held every 2 years. And the judge for the exhibits 2 years ago had kind of an equal background in weaving and sewing. And so she judged from that perspective. The piece my kiddo entered this year, the hand woven fabric that she created, was a level of complexity that is mind blowing to most weavers. The judge who judged the exhibit this year she's 90 to 95% sewing background.
Mm-hmm.
So all she looked at was the sewing construction for the most part, and completely missed the level of complexity that the weavers who were at the conference were like, holy cow, how did you pull that off? Like, that's amazing. That fabric is incredible. Like this, that, the other thing. She didn't get it. She had no clue how it was done. And so it's really hard. We talk about this all the time with my daughter. You don't know who the judge is going to be. You don't know what their background is. Some of them too in the art world want that really like whacked out artsy stuff that is like the weirder the better, and it's like, come on, really? Like so it's really, really challenging. I think sometimes you could almost lose your mind trying to guess what other people are looking for in your work. Like she kind of has to let that go to an extent. I mean, she does research the jurors and the judges who are judging at different things and tries to like dig in a little bit, but it's really hard to try to figure out how they're going to judge things and how they're going to grade things and score things and stuff like that. So I feel like that can be like a bit much to take on for yourself sometimes under certain circumstances.
Yeah, I think you have to find that balance. And again, the 2 chapters this week, they talk a lot about that. I know I have notes somewhere in here later on that's talking about that and looking at it. But there is, I definitely see people who just submit whatever they want to submit without taking into consideration who's looking at it.
Yeah.
And that's not the right way to go about it. But you also cannot kill yourself trying to completely imagine what exactly they're looking for, what exactly they want. There has to be a balance in there, right? Of keeping in mind who the audience is and that's going to vary. And I'll bring that up more later because I have a very specific example in my notes later. I know because I just typed my notes up this morning because I was so far behind.
Same girl, same.
So the next comments are mine, and that's just on page 72 and 73. So there's a discussion again on credibility and documentation. So it talks about how credibility equals documentation plus context. And I kind of liked that simplification. And now it is a simplification and in some ways an oversimplification, but I think it's important to remember that, especially when you're kind of thinking back, like Meagan was saying, we unschool and we can't, it's too hard to try to educate people on what unschooling is. If you can provide some kind of documentation and context. And so in the book, she goes on page 73, she says, quote, your annotations contribute to an artifact's and your credibility. And I hadn't really thought about annotating, but it is a good point, both on the bigger picture and, more specifically for us. Like I said, we do have to provide a small portfolio each month. And I always, it's just one sentence, but I would never just send my digital pictures and that be it. It's always the title of what it is. And then, worksheet on factoring or, like something so that she knows specifically what she's looking at. Like this page from our history curriculum, and, they were follow-up questions and review to this unit, not like, so it's not a writing sample. It's, it was review on the actual history that we were learning. And I know it's, for me, it was one of those things. I have annotated and I didn't even realize that I was doing it. And I hadn't really thought of the importance or the significance of it.
The next note that I had was also about annotating, and I see that we actually made the same note. So on the bottom of 74 and into 75, it says, annotations are necessary for full communication of your portfolio's purpose. Many reviewers, especially those with familiarity with adolescents, work is limited to school-based products, will not see evidence of deep, important learning when looking through a portfolio. Where you see a rich interdisciplinary study of the Battle of Gettysburg, they will see a collection of travel souvenirs. And I think that kind of goes to my point earlier about unschooling and like not having the time or the energy to educate people on unschooling. Like, yeah, standing up on a battlefield of Gettysburg is a much more rich experience. Doing the audio tour, reading all the signs, talking to the museum docents, getting hands-on with the exhibits. Much more engaging and memorable and impactful than reading about the Battle of Gettysburg in a book in a classroom. But somebody who views education in a very linear, traditional manner is not going to make that connection. And they're going to be like, you went on a field trip. Whoop-de-doo. Right?
Yeah,
This is a family vacation.
Yeah, that sounds fun. But not, wow, like, how much did you learn? How excited was your kid after you finished the audio tour? Like, were they just, this is amazing, and now I want to pick up the book afterwards kind of thing? It's easy to miss that. And that was it. I pulled that quote out because we travel, right? We do a lot of travel schooling. I always say we're part-time world schoolers. And it's important to remember that. We had that exact kind of situation with we did a month-long trip to Ethiopia and Madagascar, which I've talked about before. And we did amazing things and we had amazing experiences, and we went on all these tours, and we made sure we talked with locals, and we hired locals, and we volunteered with locals, and we did all of these things. And yes, I sent our teacher some pictures of those different things, but I also sent our teacher completed worksheets from unit study kind of things, because while I think our teacher is generally pretty good about, like, that's amazing, and I'm sure he learned so much, and, oh, it's so great that he gets to learn this way, and I'm living vicariously through you. At the same time, she has to put together a folder of materials, and it doesn't end with just our teacher, and she has to be able to present it to someone else. And so, if it's as simple as filling out a worksheet together and talking about what we did or how this applies or how it connects to what we learned from this tour guide, fine. We've done a little bit deeper analysis of our lived experience, and we put it on paper and we sent it into our teacher. Sometimes you got to play the game.
I was just going to say there's a component of playing the game, right? Like, yeah. And as long as you've done the work and that your kid has learned the material, I have no problem playing the game. I won't flat out lie and say my kid is splitting atoms and, mastering quantum physics. Like, that hasn't happened. So I'm not going to write it down, but I will translate what they have actually done into a language that other people understand. And I don't feel guilty about that because they don't get us. I don't get them either. So it's okay.
Yeah. Yeah,
all good.
Exactly. So I had the next comment, and it's just on the next page. So page 76, the quote is specifically, if you submit written work, make sure you indicate whether it is included primarily as a writing sample, as an essay on another subject, or as an interdisciplinary artifact showcasing both disciplines. And I thought that was a really great point. Again, if you have to submit for any reason, it changes how your teacher or your reviewer is looking at it. If this is supposed to be a writing sample, then you have to have all the correct punctuation and your grammar has to be correct. And they're looking at it with a different lens, a different rubric. But if you specify this is, an essay or a reflection on this science experiment that they did, because I can't easily send you a video of the science experiment, but I wanted them to explain what they did and what they learned. The teacher is not going to care so much about whether or not you got the 5-paragraph essay right and yada, 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 because that's not the point of it. And so it's just one of those things. Transparency for everyone involved will make everyone's life so much easier.
Mm-hmm.
Common sense, but sometimes you just need to be reminded.
Yeah, exactly. And again, for me, it's that busyness thing. I miss really obvious stuff sometimes because
Mm-hmm.
my hair's on fire all the time, and it's
Mm-hmm.
like sometimes having somebody break something down into a really basic thing, I'm like, okay, I got this now. It really helps me.
Yeah, exactly. And so kind of like that rolls in perfectly to the next thing that I had pulled out, which is on page 78. And she's talking about the narrative summary. And I I haven't done this very much. This is not my forte, but I found it helpful the way that she broke it down. She says a narrative summary asks, one, what I wanted to learn, two, how I learned it, and three, how I demonstrated or applied what I learned. And then she goes on to say that in educational circles, these three divisions would be called curriculum content, instructional practices, and assessment. You simply call them your learning story and you tell them as engagingly as possible. And I think that, as homeschoolers, sometimes we're so busy trying to prove that we can learn in a different way and we can learn just as much or more in a different way that we forget that there are easy ways to align what we're doing with what is being taught in a more traditional education setting. And I know we don't always want to try to draw apples to apples comparisons, but they're there and they can be really helpful, especially in certain circumstances.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I totally agree. Um, let's see. My next thought was on 79, which was about artifact criteria and validity. So there's a quote here that says, does each artifact make your learning visible? More importantly, do the artifacts in combination show that your learning was deep and complex? Which brought me back to that Gettysburg thing, like a map of like the museum center guidebook is not that thing, right? It doesn't
Mm-hmm.
show that complexity if that's what the person is looking for. Oh, I just found a typo in the book. Does your portfolio, do you see that there on 79? It says does you portfolio instead of your.
Yeah.
I didn't notice it when I highlighted it. I was reading
Mm-hmm.
really late though. Does your portfolio have evidence of research, communication, reasoning, problem solving, and technology skills? And I think it was last week's meeting, I talked about that presentation that I went to with the guy from Aramount who reviews the grants and scholarships and stuff like that and the applications. And he was saying, like, read each sentence individually and ask yourself certain questions about each sentence. And I thought these were great questions to think about each individual artifact that goes into your portfolio. Like, does this show deep and complex learning? And she gave examples previously in the book about like movie ticket stubs and things like that, which I have another comment later on that I'll just throw out now, which is like, I feel like depending on the circumstance and the audience and stuff like that, like she has some examples that feel scrapbooky to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like that could lean itself to being like very kindergarten craftsy in some ways. Like I feel like you'd need to be careful since people oftentimes have a view of homeschooling that's not as serious or academic, to be like a little bit on the careful side with throwing together basically a collage or a scrapbook, right, and submitting something like that. But I did like that, like, analyzing each thing, does this show deep and complex learning? Does this show forward growth, advancement? Does it connect to a larger overall objective that this person will value and understand? And to analyze each thing one at a time. I really liked that point.
Yeah. And that's another, again, it's one of those things, it comes up a lot. And so I think it can be easy to overlook it. But if you're actually reading this book, certain examples that she gives are going to stand out and kind of trigger something for you. And I think that's where the real value is in reading the book. The aha moment of like, oh, I glossed over it the other 3 times, but this one applies to me, and so this one like really makes me stop and think, how am I using that, or how am I doing that? For me, the last thing in this chapter that really stood out was on pages 82 and 83. She talks about when you think your portfolio is pretty much done, to let it rest. And I'm a big believer in that, right? Like if
Me
you
too.
write something, you absolutely cannot proofread it the same day. My kiddo, and it's hard, right? You have to make sure that you somehow convince your brain that the deadline is way later than it actually is so that you have the time. But without fail, if you try to reread something or look at something the day that you finished it, your brain sees what it means to see. It sees
Mm-hmm.
what it meant for you to put down on the paper, even if that's not what you actually put there. So, great point. Let it rest. And then I had never thought of this. And again, probably primarily because we send ours in as digital artifacts. We make photos and send them every month, but triplicate it. She's making a point about how when you take it in, a lot of times they'll want to keep a copy or they'll want to keep your version. And so, if at all possible, give them a copy or a photocopy of it so that you're keeping your originals. And I was like, hadn't even crossed my mind, and I would have completely forgotten to do it because we give samples all the time, and it's never a question of whether or not they're trying to keep my original that I actually might need for something else. So I was like, oh, that's again really obvious, but useful to remember.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I completely agree. I like the let it rest too. I'm a big fan of coming back and reading things with fresh eyes and asking other
Mhm.
people who aren't as close to the work to
Mhm.
read something. I like
Yep.
both of those concepts. Yeah.
Yep. Totally. All right. So before we dive into chapter 5, I'm going to take a quick moment to remind you that we have a buy us a coffee, or I think it's technically called buy me a coffee, but really you'd be buying us a coffee. And you can provide us beverages, but also it's just support, right? It helps us keep things going. We do a little bit of advertising and sponsorships and things like that, but podcasting is not free. And whether you know it or not, you actually make very little money podcasting. So feel free to support us by buying us a coffee. And soon enough, we will, if you can see, we are working on our merch stuff, and we've got our first couple logos that we're working on. My mug today has "Inclusive Minds Change the World," and I'm still working. I don't like the podcast name on the side, so we're going to work on redoing it across the very bottom so that we've got the podcast name on there. But you'll be able to pick up some stuff if you want, and we'll let you know once that actually goes live. We're just working on designs and things like that, but you can absolutely support us in lots of different ways, and we would love it if you would.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I know. Well, and it'll just be a fun, like, homeschool mom badge of honor too. I mean, it'll be, I like it. Okay. I live in the South. I've talked about this before. I find comfort when I see somebody else walking around with a t-shirt on that says, like, I support the band, and it's like a thing about band books, or it'll be like a black t-shirt and there'll be a white collar on it that's like screen printed on there and it's RBG's color or something, right?
Mm.
Because there's very few of us down here, and it's nice when you can find your people, where you're like, oh, you exist, thank you,
Yeah.
and so I feel like too, it's kind of like a little billboard for parents. Like, we'll have tote bags and all kinds of stuff, like when you're returning your books at the library and they're in a tote bag that talks about being a proud woke homeschooler and all that kind of stuff. Like, yes, it'll be a nice
Mm-hmm.
billboard to help you find your people, which will always be a good thing too, because depending on where you live, you have to really work a lot harder to tease them out. Trust me, I know.
Yeah, right. Find your people, or even just be, a low key message for people who needed to know that they weren't alone. Like maybe they're
Yes.
not looking for someone, but I have a t-shirt with me on this trip, and my mom, every time I put it on, she does a double take because it's got a big picture on the front of it. And I don't usually wear, like screen print t-shirts. And it's got a picture of LeVar Burton on it. And it says,
Oh,
LeVar Burton says, and then at the bottom it says, read banned books.
yeah.
And, it's that thing. I'm in Missouri. I'm vacationing in Missouri for the summer. And so I put it on with my leggings and I went to the mall in my Read Banned Books shirt. And it's that thing. I'm not here necessarily hoping to connect with other, progressive homeschool moms, but I'm hoping that the kids or, the young adults who are in the mall that happen to see it, and do the double take or read it or whatever, there's that that subtle, like there are people who get you and support you. And yeah, there are lots of
Exactly.
ways to show support in all kinds of different things.
Yeah, I do. Like when I'm at the farmer's market and I see somebody who's got a shirt that I align with, I'm always like, love your shirt. And you see the same connection in them where they're like, oh, thank you. They're like, oh, one of my people.
All right, so that brings us into chapter 5, which is called Presenting the Portfolio. Really, we are almost done with portfolio talk for a bit, I promise. Chapter 5, Presenting the Portfolio. It starts with a really nice summary of how useful a formative review is in homeschooling. And so you can use that to see progress, right? Like it's that thing sometimes as parents, you see the day-to-day progress and it's easy to forget how far they've come over a few months. And so that formative review portfolio is really helpful. Now, that said, the very next paragraph, she says, okay, and so now this chapter isn't about that. It's about the summative review that are for others outside of your immediate circle. And so that's what we're going to talk about and focus on.
I like it. So our next two notes, I feel like kind of align. I didn't necessarily highlight much of anything between 86 and 87, which is your note. But I feel like it kind of comes with my note on 85. Mm-hmm. They all kind of connect and snowball into one another. So on 85, she talks about, there's a line here that says, even if your local officials do not advocate homeschooling or are suspicious of alternative assessment, they are still bound by the laws of your state to respect your right to homeschool so long as you meet the minimum legal requirements to which you are subject. Remember, because they sometimes forget that administrators do not create laws, they implement them. And I feel like I get that it's bordering on tinfoil hat and government conspiracy and all this kind of stuff. I get it because that's where we go over the next 2 pages, right? So I totally get that. But I am a huge advocate of you knowing what is required of you, not what's suggested. When I homeschooled in North Carolina, there were requirements and there were suggestions. And the way the law was written was a little confusing. And people thought the suggestions were part of the law. They're not. So, and the reason that I bring this up is there was somebody in North Carolina when I lived there who had CPS knock on their door and she let them in and they started asking her on her like takeaway plan from CPS was all this stuff that she had to answer to or about related to homeschooling that far exceeded her legal requirements. And so, and I don't necessarily, I wasn't there, so I can't say, but I won't make the assumption that CPS was trying to be abusive of their power. I think they had no idea what the homeschool laws were. Mm-hmm. And so they weren't functioning in that. And you can't assume that someone else is going to automatically know your rights. So whatever state you are in, I am just a huge proponent of know what is required of you. And I don't give anybody an inch beyond that because I've seen too many instances where people give an inch and then a mile is taken. And I'm just not up for that game. So I'm like, nope, I will give you what is required. The end. And then it gets a little tinfoil hattish for you, Amanda. What happened then?
Yeah. So my note is just the next pages. So you've got at 86 and 87, one last word of caution. I have no problem with my children sharing their portfolios with college admission officials without my being there. But I would never permit them to sit for a formal portfolio review with the school alone. Just this, I'm like, okay, like we get it. You don't trust the government, which I find is ironic because when I was looking up, I told you she's in Massachusetts and she does like school reform in public schools. And she actually works in public schools and in teachers' colleges and doing stuff like that. And then there's all of this stuff about like how you can't trust the schools. I thought that was an interesting dynamic there.
Well, maybe she knows more than we do about, you know what I mean? Like in that sense, it's kind of like all these public school teachers who were like, I would never send my kids to public school. I'll be homeschooling my kids, right? It's like they've seen too much. So maybe that's part of it. I don't know. I don't have my tinfoil hat, so my signal might be off. I'm just saying, but it could be.
It could be. And it could also be that it was written 25 years ago and things have changed, right?
And homeschooling wasn't as accepted. Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know. But I will say that going on, I thought the information about how to create an agenda for the meeting is useful. So there's it's not actually a pull out box, but there's a know the purpose. And, it just that idea of like, know what what the purpose of your meeting is. Is it just to rubber stamp the portfolio and to sign off on a year's progress? Is it to actually evaluate the portfolio by giving the student a pop quiz? We've definitely experienced that in some of our meetings where, that was my bad. And I learned after the fact to make sure that we always review whatever artifacts I sent in, because I sent them in. They had to be provided, sometimes it's like 2 weeks before the end of the close. And then we see the teacher like a week or two after, because she's scheduling meetings with different people, and she'll pop quiz the kiddo on the stuff that I sent. And he's like, I mean, we studied that history like 4 weeks ago at this point. Like, I don't really remember like the specific question you're asking. And like, that's on me, right? I'm the parent. And if I know that that's part of our review process, all I have to do is take a minute to sit down and be like, hey, let's read through this worksheet again and make sure that we like refresh our memory on this, because she's probably going to ask you a couple questions about it. And I want to make sure that my kiddo is prepared if that's what the agenda is going to be. And so it's just that thing of like, know what's happening, know the purpose, and prepare accordingly. And then if you can, guide the agenda. But we talk about that a little bit later.
I will say, now that you know that can happen, it is on you going forward to prepare your kid for it.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm getting pretty pissed off on behalf of you and your kid right now, because no one is randomly calling a public school kid into an office 2 weeks after they've done something and asking them to regurgitate information.
Yeah.
Right. And so like, I'm a little pissed off on your behalf right now that happens, but we continue.
It's true. I mean, and that's the reality, right? There are different standards that are often set for public school versus homeschool kids. And it's that question of, do you, where do you play the game and where do you fight against it? How much does it matter to you?
Yeah, you become that mom.
Yeah, you just right. you have to decide which is your hill and which isn't. And then the next page, it talks about who is your reviewer. And I thought this was actually a good point. If you're in a situation where you have to do these reviews, it is important to think about it, because if you have the superintendent, they're not going to ask the same questions or have the same conversation with you as the teacher that you see every month. If you are talking with a principal, again, they'll ask probably different questions than the superintendent would. They'll have some overlap with what a classroom teacher would, but it probably won't be the same. A guidance counselor is not going to ask the same things as a classroom teacher. And so just find out who your reviewer is and kind of prepare accordingly. And it's hard to do the first time, I mean, you'll make mistakes, just like I shared. We didn't review and we weren't prepared for what we were getting into. But the more you know. The more you know. All right. So I have the next comment too on page 89. I just said, in general, this chapter talks a lot about non-test assessments, right? Alternative assessments, and how to make sure your reviewer knows how to assess beyond tests and written work. And so on page 89, at the top of the page, it gives some examples that we find important and exciting, but cautions about what you share and how you share it so that you aren't dismissed as fluff, and again, it's that thing, for better or worse, this still happens. I don't think it's as bad as it used to be, but you don't want to submit your family vacation scrapbook in their eyes. And so just, again, there's some component of playing the game, and it was just a good kind of reminder of what that looks like. But it is also talked about quite often in here.
Yeah. I have the next two notes, which are very small notes, but one was on page 91, where there's a call out box that says, show your enthusiasm. And she talks about meeting with or an evaluator at one point through the school system. It was a principal. And the principal says, you look so serious and you love this, she exclaimed. you've got to smile more. And there's just something about, even if it's a woman or telling another human being that they need to smile more to be interpreted properly, just aggravates me. Like, why? No. Mm-mm. Especially if we're going to be a neurodivergent affirming podcast, like body language and things like that are different. Everybody expresses themselves differently through tone, through body language, through word choices, things like that. Like, use multidisciplinary interpretation styles to figure out what the person's mood is, or their intention, or their thought. Like, you can't base everything on a smile. It's the same thing as demanding that autistics give you eye contact for respect. Like, it's just the whole thing just pissed me off. So anyway, that was there. 92. There are some links on the bottom of page 92 that are links to professional journals that school administrators are likely reading on educational leadership, school administration, things like that. And kind of like Amanda was talking before about aesthetics and Googling like what the trendy things are with aesthetics and being current. She talks here about kind of having the same lingo as the people who are reviewing your things, so that you can apples to apples a little bit better with these people, and they'll understand you and you'll understand them, and kind of digging in. Am I going to take the time to do that? No. But if you're in a very high regulation state where you're interacting with the school system an awful lot, or if you have like a charter program or something like that, that might be something that's time well spent just to minimize your issues down the road and make your path smoother. It's like, put the work in now for a smoother journey ahead kind of situation by kind of reading some of those things. So I found that pretty helpful.
Yeah. And I have definitely had to do that with our charter school on a few different things, right? Where it's like, we are not talking the same language, and they're making me feel like I'm just that crazy mom who doesn't understand how school works. And it's helpful to be able to go to their journal articles, their peer reviewed material, the resources that are put out for public schools, and be able to pull a little section and drop the link and be like, here's the full thing, like this is what I was referring to. They can't blow you off, and for better or worse, if anytime you're having to answer to an authoritative figure, if they don't like what you're saying or they don't agree, it's really easy for them to try to blow you off. So, being able to support yourself and what you're saying with resources that they won't be like, yeah, but that's for homeschoolers. And, oh, yes, because homeschoolers are less than. Okay, sure. Right.
Exactly.
Okay, so I have the next comment, and that's the agenda, setting your expectations for the meeting. So on page 93, she is talking about actually creating an agenda for your meeting where you're going to get together with the reviewer. She's saying to write a letter that sets the agenda and your expectations. And I've not done much of that, but I thought it was an interesting idea, especially if you're doing like a semester review. And if you are doing any kind of an IEP, I got this same kind of advice. I got it a little late in the process, but that whole kind of like writing a letter that clearly states what you want out of it, what you're expecting to get, and then they know what you're coming in with. And if they disagree with something in your letter, hopefully they've gotten back to you and said, no, this is actually what we're going to be doing. Just give some structure and protection in general. And then kind of on the next page, 94, she goes on to point out a couple of things that are really good for your high regulation states to request to review your cumulative folder. So if they have a cumulative folder that they're keeping, which most schools will or districts will, you have to let them know ahead of time in writing. So you put that in this letter. And she just had, as always, we'd like to see the folder. And also to let them know if you want to record it. And we also, that's a requirement here. You have to put it in writing ahead of time. And so it's easy to stick it in this letter. She gives a couple easy examples of like, you could say that your spouse couldn't attend, but they want to be able to hear what was discussed. Or even something as simple as you don't want to worry about taking notes because you want to be able to fully participate, but you want to make sure you didn't miss anything. And so I thought those were also a couple of really good points of like, oh, I hadn't thought of that. I did practice it a bit with the IEP process, and good for certain types of reviews, right? Not every review you're going to be able to send them a letter ahead of time setting the agenda, but if you can.
I like those two ways of approaching the recording thing too, because it kind of lowers people's defenses a little bit if you approach it that way, which I thought was really helpful.
Yep, for sure.
My next note is on 103, and it talks about portfolios for legal purposes. We see numerous posts all the time about people who are getting divorced.
Yeah.
And the husband or the ex-spouse or the partner or the biological whatever uses homeschooling as a weapon. And, you know, you've been successfully homeschooling and they were totally on board with homeschooling and now they're not. And so I thought it brought it up here and I thought, yes, this is great. Now, on the flip side, I'm also thinking, okay, here you are, you're going through a divorce, your world is falling apart. You're now single parenting. There's probably going to be financial constraints that go along with that, which generate stress. Go build a portfolio, have the best time ever, right? I mean, yeah, that sucks. Like, it sucks on so many levels, but at least there's a roadmap here to help cover your behind for homeschooling. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of throw that out there. I really liked that component of the cover your behind concept with portfolios.
Yeah, I flagged that same thing. And it's that idea that, you know, when you're doing other reviews, they at least know you're homeschoolers and they don't see a lot of you, but they do see you. And so they have a bit more of an understanding about alternative assessments. The reality is there's probably no judge sitting on the bench who knows hardly anything at all about alternative assessments. And so just that idea, you might have to do some education and you might even just, you know, if you have any kind of standardized testing that you've done, or even just taking one of the easy standardized tests that you do at home and sticking it in there to show where your kid is at, you know, if they do well, like just the things that make it easy that they're going to understand, right? Like just sometimes, again, this is one of those examples, sometimes you just have to play the game. But I thought it was really good and really useful for parents who are in that, because we do see that a lot. So just on the next...
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, I just suggested the cat test to somebody on a divorce post. I was like, your kid will look like a genius. Throw it in there. So yeah.
Yeah, no, exactly. Right. You know, like, and anything that's like a standardized test that the judge will be like, oh, I know standardized tests. Okay, great. You know, like, yeah. And then my last comment was on page 110. And I just thought it was interesting because, as we've mentioned, this book was published in 2000. So, you know, essentially it was written 25 years ago. And she has a line that says, do you know that employers consider themselves lucky when their workers consistently show up for work? And she kind of goes on talking about how people don't show up for work and they're not on time. And anytime you have those attributes, you know, it's a good thing because it's not common. And it just made me laugh, right? Because every generation talks about how the younger generation is lazy and they don't want to work hard and they don't this and they're quiet quitting and they're this and they're that. And I was like, this is a perfect example. I feel like you could hear, read, see the exact same thing in a book published now about, you know, like, and it didn't used to be that way. And like, except this book was written 25 years ago and it was that way then, you know, like, yeah, I thought that was good for a chuckle.
Speaking of chuckle, okay, before I said something about, I feel like this book is about 20 years old, and I said something, and then you were like 25 years old, and I was like, oh, wow, I thought I had seen that it was written in 2000, but oh, it must be before that. Like, to me, 2000 was 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And then when you just said it, you just connected the dots, and you were like, it's 24 years old, 2020. I'm like, oh my gosh, it's closer to 25 than it is 20. And in my head, 2000 was 20 years ago, right? Oh my gosh, it's bad. It's really bad. All right. Well, that wraps us up for this episode. I forget if it was in this episode or a previous episode, but Amanda was basically talking about like podcasting and all this kind of stuff. Yeah, we'd love it if you could just go in and give us a thumbs up. Like, wherever you listen to us, just give us a thumbs up or a 5-star or whatever it is on your service, right? We are this little tiny grassroots group trying to build a movement of progressive, inclusive homeschoolers that are secular and who love homeschooling and love their kids and all that kind of stuff. And whether we like it or not, talk about playing the game, we need to play the algorithm game, right? And so if you can give us a review or a thumbs up or a like or whatever, and plus it just really makes us happy. Like, we literally message one another when stuff comes out. We're like, oh my gosh. So
did you see this one?
Exactly.
Every once in a while, did you see this one? Why are they so... Yeah. So make it a happy. Did you see this one?
Yeah, drown those ones out. Let's kill those ones with kindness. So, but yes, we would greatly appreciate it. So, thank you so much for joining us today and for tuning in. We will be continuing our discussion of portfolios and transcripts next week. But in the meantime, happy homeschooling.
Yeah. Have a great one.